The ice storm of 2013 hit North America unexpectedly, highlighting vulnerabilities in regions unaccustomed to severe winter weather. What unexpected challenges did this storm reveal? The storm brought more than just icy roads. It shook up everyday life in ways many never saw coming. Over 1.5 million people lost power due to ice-covered trees and power lines collapsing under the weight. The freezing temperatures made it nearly impossible for repair crews to work quickly, and the fallen trees blocked access to crucial areas. Transportation came to a standstill. Roads were a skating rink, causing countless accidents. Airports canceled hundreds of flights, stranding passengers just before the holidays. Even schools and businesses had to shut down, disrupting normal routines for millions. The economic impact was staggering. Damages ranged from $54 million to $200 million, with many businesses unable to recover lost revenue. For homeowners, the storm meant costly repairs from falling branches and water damage as the ice melted. In Canada, Toronto was hit especially hard. Over 300,000 residents in the city alone lost power. Community centers turned into warming shelters where people could find heat, food, and a place to sleep. By Christmas, tens of thousands were still in the cold, with some needing help even into the new year. Maine had a similar story. Over 123,000 homes lost electricity. Crews from neighboring states worked tirelessly, but the outages lasted through Christmas for many families. Across the Midwest, places like Michigan saw the largest storm-related power loss in over a decade. In some areas, it wasn't just the ice, but floods that added to the chaos, making cleanup even tougher. The storm also sparked 13 tornadoes in the southern US, including a strong EF2 that left a trail of destruction through Arkansas and Mississippi. Entire mobile homes were destroyed, and trees snapped like twigs. It became clear that power grids needed to be tougher, especially in areas not used to harsh winters. On a personal level, people started preparing for the worst, keeping supplies ready, staying informed, and planning for backup heat sources. The North American ice storm of 1998 was one of the most destructive in recorded history, affecting parts of Canada and the northeastern United States and leaving millions without power. Could this storm have been a wake-up call for the infrastructure resilience? This storm didn't just freeze roads and trees, it brought life to a standstill for weeks in some areas. Over 4 million people lost power, some for a month. In Quebec, the damage was so severe that some areas were nicknamed the Triangle of Darkness because they were without power for so long. The weight of the ice was unbelievable. Power lines snapped, 1,000 steel transmission towers crumbled, and 35,000 wooden utility poles fell. It wasn't just infrastructure that suffered. Farmers faced heartbreaking losses as barns collapsed under the ice, killing livestock, and maple syrup producers lost thousands of trees. Hitting an industry Quebec is famous for. Montreal's Mount Royal Park saw 80% of its tree damaged, with many needing years of recovery. Travel was nearly impossible. Bridges and tunnels in Montreal closed due to safety concerns, and chunks of ice falling from buildings made walking downtown dangerous. The city's water pumping stations were knocked offline, adding to the chaos. In Maine, over half the state's residents lost power, and the storm became the deadliest natural disaster in its history. The Canadian military was deployed in what became their largest operation since the Korean War. Over 15,000 personnel worked alongside utility crews to clear the roads, rescue stranded people, and restore power. In some places, locomotives were even used to power small towns temporarily. What stood out was how communities and governments learned from this disaster. Power grids were redesigned, and stricter standards for infrastructure were enforced to handle heavy ice. In 2009, an ice storm swept across the northeastern United States, teaching valuable lessons about emergency preparedness and response. How did communities adapt to the freezing chaos? The 2009 ice storm didn't just freeze the landscape, it disrupted lives across multiple states. Over 2 million people lost power, with Kentucky hit the hardest. 500,000 homes went dark, and some stayed like that for a week. Arkansas wasn't far behind, with 300,000 residents without power. You might think losing power is just an inconvenience, but with freezing temperatures, it became a life-threatening situation for many. Tragically, 65 people lost their lives, and in Kentucky alone, 35 deaths were recorded. A lot of these deaths were preventable. Carbon monoxide poisoning became a significant risk as people turned to indoor generators and kerosene heaters without proper ventilation. The damage to infrastructure was immense. Thick ice-coated power lines, snapping them like twigs. Roads turned into dangerous ice sheets, making emergency response a challenge. Even Mammoth Cave National Park had to close its doors due to the storm. With so many communities affected, the scale of response was massive. Kentucky Governor Steve Beshear called up the entire Kentucky Army National Guard, marking the largest mobilization in the state's history. These troops worked alongside utility crews to clear debris, restore power, and help residents in distress. But power wasn't the only concern. Water systems were at risk too. Teams from rural water associations across multiple states rushed in with portable generators to ensure communities still had access to clean water. Emergency responders also set up warming shelters, provided food, and coordinated rescue efforts in the hardest hit areas. This storm showed how essential teamwork and preparation are when nature throws its worst at us. From state governments to local communities, everyone had to adapt quickly to tackle the challenges. The 1994 ice storm caused widespread power outages in the southern United States, prompting changes in utility companies' approach to winter weather. What innovations emerged from this icy ordeal? The 1994 ice storm hit the southern United States hard, leaving entire communities struggling to recover for weeks. Mississippi, Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, and parts of Texas all felt the weight, literally, of 2 to 5 inches of ice that coated everything in sight. Over $300 million in damages was reported, and Mississippi had to declare federal disaster status across 26 counties. Power outages were a massive problem. Over 500,000 people were left in the dark, and for many, it wasn't just for a day or two. It stretched into weeks. Mississippi Power and Light shared that about 20% of the state's population experienced disruptions, while smaller power companies had an even tougher time getting services back up. The agriculture sector took a serious hit. Mississippi's famous pecan orchards were devastated, with 5% of the state's trees destroyed and thousands of acres severely damaged. It wasn't a quick fix either. Production took years to recover. This was a stark reminder of how vulnerable the region's agriculture was to extreme weather. Water systems also struggled. Over 300,000 people had to boil water before using it because of supply disruptions. Roads? They became icy traps, making travel incredibly dangerous and cutting off access to essential services. Schools and universities had no choice but to shut down for weeks, which showed how unprepared many institutions were for these types of events. What came next were lessons that reshaped how utility companies and governments prepared for winter weather. Power companies got serious about tree management. Aggressive trimming programs became the norm, ensuring branches wouldn't bring down power lines during future storms. The power grid itself saw upgrades too. Wooden poles were swapped for more durable materials, and transmission lines were reinforced to handle heavier loads. Meteorologists also stepped up their game. The storm underscored how vital accurate weather predictions were. Tools like the WSR-88D radar system were introduced to keep an eye on freezing rain events, helping utilities brace for the impact more effectively. Governments learned to mobilize faster. Repair crews and resources started being pre-positioned before storms hit, cutting down response times. Public awareness campaigns became a priority, teaching people to keep emergency kits ready and use backup heat sources safely. The Great Ice Storm of 1951 paralyzed the central United States, with ice accumulations exceeding 2 inches and causing significant economic and infrastructural impacts. How did this storm set the stage for future winter preparedness? The Great Ice Storm of 1951, also known as Nashville's Great Blizzard, shut down the city from January 29th to February 1st, creating chaos that lingered for days after the skies cleared. By the time the storm ended, Nashville was buried under 8 inches of ice and snow, with temperatures plunging to record lows of negative 13 degrees Fahrenheit. The storm crippled transportation, knocked out power, and disrupted daily life like no other winter event in the city's history. The power outages alone impacted over 80,000 residents, leaving homes dark and freezing. Gas and oil furnaces ran dry, forcing families to huddle around wood-burning stoves or kerosene lamps. Streets were a nightmare, with hundreds of cars abandoned and trees blocking major roads. Businesses shut their doors for 3 days, and even Eastern Airlines canceled all flights. Train schedules were thrown into chaos, with delays lasting as long as 2 days. The damage to infrastructure, including communication and transportation systems, exceeded $2 million, a staggering amount in 1951. The storm's heavy precipitation also pushed the Cumberland River to a near flood stage, adding the threat of flooding to an already dire situation. Meanwhile, sub-zero temperatures made recovery efforts grueling. Power lines snapped under the weight of the ice, roofs caved in, and telephones went silent. On February 5th, as the city began to thaw, residents who had been stuck indoors rushed out all at once, causing what is still remembered as Nashville's worst traffic jam. Weather records show that the storm brought a remarkable 11.9 inches of ice and snow over 5 days. The combination of freezing rain, sleet, and snow created a thick, icy glaze that snapped trees like matchsticks. The sounds of cracking branches and arcing power lines became an eerie soundtrack for the city. The Great Ice Storm of 1951 became a harsh lesson in resilience for Nashville, proving how vulnerable communities could be to rare but devastating natural events. It set a precedent for preparedness that still echoes in disaster management today. In 2005, the Midwest United States experienced a severe ice storm, leading to environmental and social impacts that were felt for years. What lasting changes did the storm inspire? The Midwest was struck hard by the ice storm of January 2005, leaving cities and towns coated in sheets of ice up to half an inch thick. Freezing rain swept across southern Minnesota, northern Iowa, and central Wisconsin, turning roads into skating rinks and snapping power lines under the icy weight. Thousands of homes were left in the dark, with families relying on stovetops, candles, and flashlights to get through the long, frigid nights. Many residents had no choice but to gather at relatives' house or seek shelter elsewhere. Entire households squeezed into small places, trying to stay warm without electricity or heat. Power outages stretched on for days, making it clear how vulnerable the region's infrastructure was to winter storms. Some families described chaotic scenes of kids running around, adults scrambling to adapt, and everyone braving the cold together. The ice accumulation was heaviest in parts of Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin, where towns like Ultra and Chatfield saw up to half an inch of ice. Streets became nearly impassable, with cars sliding off roads and emergency responders struggling to reach people in need. Businesses shut their doors, schools were canceled, and local governments urged people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary. For many, the storm was a stark reminder of how quickly conditions can change. Some recalled the eerie quiet of neighborhoods blanketed in ice, interrupted only by the sound of tree branches snapping and wires arcing as they hit the ground. Transportation came to a halt, with snowplows and salt trucks struggling to keep up. The storm's aftermath pushed communities to rethink their preparedness for extreme winter weather. Utility companies faced pressure to strengthen power grids, and local governments began improving their emergency response strategies. Residents also learned the importance of personal preparedness. Keeping supplies like blankets, candles, and non-perishable food on hand became standard practice for many. Environmental damage was significant too. Ice-laden trees broke apart, littering streets and parks with debris. Crews worked around the clock to clear roads and restore power, but recovery took weeks in some areas. The storm highlighted the importance of maintaining infrastructure, from trimming trees near power lines to ensuring backup energy resources were available. The ice storm of 2005 left its mark not just in the destruction it caused, but in the lessons it taught. The changes it inspired continued to shape how the Midwest braces for winter storms today. The Quebec Ice Storm of 1920 devastated the region, with long-term effects on the local economy and infrastructure. How did this historic storm influence modern disaster management? The Quebec Ice Storm of 1920 was a stark reminder of nature's unrelenting power. It swept across the region, coating everything in layers of ice and paralyzing daily life. The combination of freezing rain and frigid temperatures created conditions that overwhelmed the area's ability to respond. Entire towns were plunged into darkness, with power lines and communication systems collapsing under the weight of accumulating ice. Reports from the time described roads turned into dangerous ice tracks, making travel nearly impossible. Communities were effectively cut off from one another as transportation ground to a halt. Many relied on wood-burning stoves to stay warm, while others struggled to find alternative heating methods in the freezing conditions. The storm didn't just affect the people. It left a lasting impact on the landscape. Trees snapped under the immense weight, with some areas losing entire forests. For industries like maple syrup production, the loss of so many trees was a devastating blow, one that took decades to recover from. Farmers also faced heavy losses as livestock succumbed to the cold, and damaged crops meant a poor harvest season. Infrastructure took one of the hardest hits. Electricity was a luxury in many parts of Quebec at the time, but where it did exist, the storm brought it to its knees. Telegraph and telephone lines, lifelines for communication, were left in tatters. The damage was so extensive that repairs took months, and some rural areas were forced to rely on older methods of communication until full services could be restored. The 1920 ice storm pushed the region to rethink its preparedness for severe weather. Local governments began focusing on infrastructure that could better withstand extreme conditions, and more attention was paid to tree management near power lines to prevent similar catastrophes. While meteorology at the time was limited, the storm highlighted the importance of weather monitoring and early warnings to give communities more time to prepare. This storm also brought out stories of resilience and mutual aid. Neighbors supported each other by sharing firewood, food, and other essentials. Temporary shelters became lifelines for families whose homes were too cold to endure. Decades later, the storm remains a pivotal moment in the region's history. It not only shaped how Quebec prepared for winter disasters, but also reinforced the need for stronger, more adaptable infrastructure and community solidarity in the face of the extreme weather. The New England ice storm of 1921 left a lasting impression on the region, shaping future responses to similar events. What lessons from this storm still resonate today? For over 75 hours, from November 25th to November 29th, 1921, New England faced a relentless ice storm that coasted the region in over 4 inches of ice. The storm hit was hardest in Worcester County, extending through central and Massachusetts, as well as northern Connecticut, Rhode Island, and parts of Vermont and New Hampshire. By the time it was over, transportation had come to a halt. Power was out in large areas, and schools and businesses were shut down. In Needham, Massachusetts, the storm left its mark in unforgettable ways. The first 2 days of freezing rain didn't cause too much trouble, but by Sunday night, power lines began to snap under the weight of the ice, lighting up the sky with sparks as live wires fell. Residents described the eerie sound of trees cracking and crashing to the ground. The Needham Chronicle reported how the noise of breaking branches echoed through the town, likening it to the sharp crack of gunfire, followed by the roaring crash of entire trees collapsing. When the storm finally ended, the damage was overwhelming. Needham's iconic elm trees, planted in the mid-1800s along Great Plain Avenue, were decimated. Some were completely destroyed, while others were left so damaged that they would never recover. The Board of Selectmen encouraged residents to use the fallen wood from the streets and clear debris in front of their properties. Despite the destruction, no lives were lost, though there were many close calls. Branches narrowly missed homes and children passing by. One family on Carter Street had their house burned to the ground due to fallen wires, but thankfully, they escaped unharmed. Efforts to restore power and communication began immediately. Utility workers managed to set up temporary fixes, and by Wednesday, some emergency functions were back. A generator was sent to recharge the telephone's switchboard batteries so that emergency calls could be made. Electricity from trolley circuits were also diverted to power streetlights at key intersections. However, it would take much longer to return to normalcy, with reports weeks later showing ongoing repairs. The storm left scars not just on the landscape, but also on the town's spirit. Needham lost its historic elm-lined streets, and many of the remaining trees were further damaged during later storms or pruning efforts. Yet the 1921 storm taught valuable lessons about resilience and preparation. Which ice storm story impacted you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know if you'd like to see a part 2 exploring more ice storm events. Join us next time as we delve deeper into the events that have shaped our world, because every ice storm has a story worth telling.